I don't like the way you're conversating about me. Or, what do you do when people are talking bad about you? Welcome to another installment in the Over My Shoulder Bible Study series. These brief video Bible studies typically serve to supplement the sermon that I preach each Sunday here with Missouri Street Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Currently, I'm privileged to preach through what's known as Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. You'll find it in Luke chapter 6, beginning in about verse 17, running through the end of the chapter, verse 49. We're still in the first third or half of the sermon where Jesus is talking about blessings and woes. And one of the woes that people receive, he says, is actually a time for blessing for you. It's when you're insulted because of the Son of Man. Or, to put it another way, when people curse you. You need to see that as a time of blessing. It's a pretty tall calling, a high order, isn't it? Well, what is this blessing like? Tell me more about this, Jesus. How is it that when people hate me, they're my enemies, that I'm supposed to love them? Tell me how that when people hate me, I'm supposed to do them good. How is it that when people curse me, I'm supposed to bless them? How is it that when people mistreat me, I'm to pray for them? Could you elaborate? Let's do that. You know, one of the people listening to this sermon was Peter, Simon Peter. And about 3 decades or so after Jesus said these words and Peter first heard them, after a lifetime of reflecting on them and practicing them, Peter writes a letter to a large number of Christians spread over a very large region, a letter we have today known as 1 Peter. And these Christians that he's writing to are going through a terrible ordeal. This is the way he describes it near the start of his letter in chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. In this, you greatly rejoice. You're suffering, grief, and all kinds of trials. But the reason this has come is to test and prove that your faith is genuine, that it's truly valuable, that it will result in praise and glory and honor when Christ is revealed. He'll say something like the very same thing toward the latter part of the letter in chapter 4 and verse 12 when he says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that's come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." This letter, 1 Peter, is written in part, large part, to help train Christians as to how to use their tongue when the world is talking bad about them, talking bad to them, how to respond. At the start of this video, I mentioned that a possible title for this episode could be, "I don't like the way you're conversating about me." That came from an experience of my newly turned 9-year-old granddaughter. She was being spoken ill of at a playground of late by several people. They were verbally abusing her. Finally, she'd had enough, and she looked them in the eye and said, "I don't like the way you're conversating about me." What would Peter say to my granddaughter, to you, to me, to any of us as believers when we receive cursing and insult, verbal abuse? What to do? I can only touch on some of the matters, not a comprehensive study of 1 Peter in this video. I'd encourage you to read the letter and make your own list as you comb through the letter carefully. But let's note a few matters. In chapter 2 and verse 1, Peter says you need to make sure that you rid yourself of anything like what you're receiving, whether it's malice or deceit or hypocrisy or envy, or we're straight into verbal abuse here directly, aren't we now? Slander of every kind. Peter says you've got to make sure that your life is right here. A little later, not all that much later, he'll say in chapter 2 and verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. It's reverb from what Jesus said, isn't it? Jesus said there's going to be people who hate you. And how do you respond to hate? You respond to it by doing good deeds. Here, just a few verses later, he'll go a little further on the subject. It's God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Yeah, it's by our behavior of consistently doing good to those who are treating us badly that we shut them up. This may not always work, but it is a tool in the toolbox. And Peter says you need to make sure you use that tool. Drop down a little further. This may be the heart of the matter. How is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and enduring it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. Here Peter seems to be saying, I know this isn't always a foolproof answer to silencing ignorant talk, this doing good to them. It certainly wasn't a perfect fix for Jesus. Jesus always did good, but it didn't shut up his accusers. In fact, they wound up killing him. He endured it. And so you may need to do the very same thing. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Despite all this that he had to endure, all this ignorant talk of foolish people, he committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. He didn't give back what he had been receiving, very much like what Peter had said toward the beginning. Notice how it continues. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. This will require, no doubt, a great deal of prayer on our part and forethought, anticipation of these things and preparation. We're going to keep a good hold on our own tongue, keep a grip on reality here. When Jesus suffered, he made no threats. Jesus wasn't interested in giving payback. He was simply interested in enduring what he had to endure and doing what he could do to silence people's foolish ways so that he might win them to a walk that's like his Father. Well, a little further. Notice verse 15 and 16. Sometimes people are malicious in the way they ask questions, mockingly. In your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared. There's that preparation and anticipation again. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. I think from the context it's about to become clear that this is not a sincere inquiry. This isn't a question spoken in this sort of tone. I'm fascinated by this walk that you claim to have with Jesus Christ. Can you tell me about that? What's the reason you have this sort of hope? It's more like, oh, you're a Christian. Yeah, what kind of hope is that? Tell me about it. Notice how Peter puts it. Make sure that you give this answer with gentleness and respect, and that you keep a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Peter's not changing the subject here. He's elaborating on what it means to be asked about your faith, but it's done in a malicious way. It comes from preparation. That's how you can handle it. And it comes from having a heart and mind, a conscience, a spirit that's kept clear. You want to be like the gentle shepherd that you serve, and so be gentle. And just as you reverence Christ and he's there with you and you revere him as Lord, you want to respect those that are also made in God's image, even if they are acting foolishly and giving you ignorant talk. One more we'll note here. Chapter 4 and verse 14. Remember we said near the beginning of the video that Peter was writing to Christians that were going through a fiery ordeal of abuse and that they shouldn't think that it was strange. Jesus went through it. Why should they think it would be strange if they did? This is no new thing if we go through it today. But we should have the same attitude that Jesus spoke of. Rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. It sounds a whole lot like saying, blessed are you when people hate you and you do them good. Blessed are you when they curse you and you bless them in return. Blessed are you when people mistreat you and you pray for them. You need to love your enemies. Notice how Peter goes from here. Rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted, Peter says, because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Profound thoughts. Whenever we don't like the way people are conversating about us, simply because we believe, when we are the recipients of verbal abuse because we're trying to be a Christian, How do we respond? In part, the answer is something like this. Make sure that your life is truly living after the Lord, not a compromised or halfway wishy-washy life for Jesus. As you do this checklist of your own life, make sure that you're doing good actively to those who are trying to speak ignorant and foolish things to you. Your response is not passive, it's active. You actively do them good. If that doesn't solve the matter, it could be that you simply need to endure it. That's exactly what happened with Jesus Christ. And part of that enduring it may be just simply keeping your mouth completely shut. And though you may be tempted at times to retaliate or to offer a threat, don't go there. Sometimes the abuse that we receive takes the form of questions, mocking questions. And when that happens, you just need to remember that Jesus had to go through that. It may be that you would do best to think ahead of time of the kind of situations that you'll probably face and have an answer already formulated, ready to give them. But the key thing is not having so much the exact right answer that fits the moment. It's the tone and spirit with which you give it. Make sure that it's done with gentleness. We serve the gentle shepherd, and so we, his sheep, must be gentle as well. And if we truly do reverence Christ as Lord, then we will respect those who are made in our Father's image in the way that we answer. When we are insulted, we need to remember that Jesus understands, and he suffered through these things himself. And so we have an opportunity to identify more profoundly with Jesus Christ. Peter will say more in this letter, and there's more than can be said just in 1 Peter. It's all over the New Testament. But the bottom line is when we don't like the way people are conversating about us, when we are receiving verbal abuse, the key thing is to replicate Christ in our response. May God give us grace and peace to that end.